the battles on the Eastern Front. These mostly happened on the German-Russian border and also on the Austro-Hungarian and Russian border. Mainly the only troops that fought there were Russia versus the Central Powers. And also the Serbs helped out as well. This was a more mobile war than what you saw on the Western Front with the trench warfare. However, there were still stalemates and there were still large bloody battles for the same reason that they were still using the old tactics against new technology, except this time there wasn't as much no man's land between the trenches because there weren't that many trenches. Here you see a map of the Battle of the Somme that was talked about in the previous video segment. And as you can see from the lines, that the people don't really advance or retreat much. And keep in mind that this is over months of fighting, and they're barely covering any ground between the trenches. Another photo of soldiers in the trenches, presumably waiting to go over the top, which meant they were going to attack the enemy. And the reason you can tell that is A, they're all massed together, and B, they have bayonets fixed, so they're ready for a charge. So back to August 1914 again, but once again we're on the Eastern Front. The Russians invaded both Germany and Austria-Hungary, and at first were successful. Neither side was prepared for the Russians to attack so quickly. They thought it would take them longer to mobilize. However, Germany swiftly counterattacked at the Battle of Tannenberg. It was a 4-day battle, and the Germans completely crushed the Russian troops and sent them in full retreat. And during the battle, 30,000 Russians were killed. The Russians were more successful against Austria-Hungary. They defeated them twice in September of 1914 and were driving deep into that country towards the capital. However, by December of 1914, the Austrians had stopped the Russian advance and had begun to push them out of their country all the way back to the border. Russia struggled a lot during World War I for many different reasons. They weren't well equipped enough, they didn't have enough supplies, they didn't have enough transportation, the troops weren't properly trained. So when they go to fight, they were not very successful. The only thing that Russia had as an advantage was the large quantity of men in the service for them. By 1916, the Russian war effort was near collapse. The troops weren't obeying orders, or they were mutinying, which means that they were going against their own officers, so things were not good. There were shortages on the front line of food, and people back home were starving as well. Russia was not as industrialized as the rest of Europe, so they couldn't keep up with the pace and the demand of all the wartime supplies. The Allies tried to help Russia by bringing in shipments of food, supplies, guns, things like that. However, those shipments were halted by the German Navy in the Baltic Sea and in the North Sea by the Ottomans. It would stop those ships from getting in there, so Russia was kind of isolated and on its own. The Ottoman Empire controlled the Mediterranean and the Black Seas, so there really was no way to get Russia the supplies it needed. So during the war effort, they were hurting quite a lot for supplies and ammunition, any type of wartime goods. Russia did have its #1 asset, and that was numbers. Even though they suffered many losses, it was very easy for them to refill their ranks. They would simply just go back out, recruit more peasants, put them in uniform, and send them out. The #1 thing that they do, they don't win a lot of battles. However, they do tie up hundreds of thousands of German troops. Those troops have to defend Germany and Austria-Hungary and not go fight in the West against the Allies. So that is how the biggest contribution that Russia will make to World War I. The war will also spread to Africa, Southwest and Southeast Asia. Mainly in these places, what happens is the Allies decide to strike there so that Germany and her allies won't have access to any natural resources from their colonies anymore. The other way that these areas will contribute, that we'll talk about more in depth in just a few minutes, is that the people that do have colonies, A, can still get the natural resources, but B, they also will get some help in manpower as well. So the war really does become a global conflict. Australia and Japan join the Allies. India, like I said, it was a British colony. It supplied lots of troops that actually fought directly in the war. The Ottoman Empire which is today the Middle East, joined the Central Powers. So the battlefield really goes from Europe to all around the world now. The Allies had a plan, and it was to take the Dardanelles, which would grant them access to Constantinople, the Ottoman capital, also known as Istanbul, and then they could get Allied shipments into Russia so that they could continue to help in the war effort, which would be quite helpful. Here are the Dardanelles. So here, this is the Mediterranean. What you need to do is you would need to sail around this way or through here. Now this entire island would have to be taken. If you were to take this island, you could then sail here. If you don't take this island, all the gun batteries and everything here will basically destroy your ships as they pass by. So the thought process here was to invade Dardanelles Islands, take over them, and then open up a shipping lane. And we are going to go ahead and talk about this campaign, which is known as the Gallipoli campaign. Here's Istanbul or Constantinople, as I told you. And as I said, if you want to get through to the Black Sea and Russia, you have to get through Gallipoli and then through here as well. So this would be the first key stage in securing a shipping lane here. Here's a picture of the landing forces as they make an amphibious assault on Gallipoli campaign, the Dardanelles Islands. Now, as you can see right here, as soon as they get off those small beaches, they already have an uphill battle. This is mostly rock and sand and debris, and it only gets worse from here. So this campaign is already racked with lots of problems just based on geography alone. So February 1915, the Gallipoli campaign. The British, Australian, New Zealand, and French troops launched several different assaults on the Gallipoli Peninsula, which was the western side of the strait that I just showed you. The Turkish troops, the part of the Ottoman Empire, had German officers in charge of them, and they were well defended in the region. Like I said, terrain very rocky, you have lots of dugouts, your trenches there are even more fortified because they're not mud. So by May of 1915, a few months later, there's a stalemate. The Allies are not moving very far inland, and they dig trenches. Once again, now you're back to trench warfare. By December of 1915, the Allies gave up, retreated completely from the campaign, and go away. They had 250,000 casualties. Now we'll talk about battles in Africa and in Asia. As I said a few slides ago, Germany's colonies came under attack. In Asia, Japan attacked German outposts in China and the Pacific Islands and was successful there. Most of these outposts didn't have lots of troops, few troops, very little navy, because most of the troops, navy, and supplies were in Europe fighting the major battles there. So it's quite easy for Japan to defeat and conquer those places. In Africa, England and France attacked Germany's colonies, and they were able to take over 3/4 of them for the same reason. Germany didn't commit many troops or supplies to the region because it wasn't of strategic importance. They wanted to concentrate their forces in Europe. That effectively would take away supplies from the Central Powers. The British and French also used their colonies to their advantage besides resources, but by getting laborers from South Africa, Senegal, Egypt, Algeria, and Indochina to help with the war effort, work in factories and shipping, fight directly in the war, build trenches, do all types of other things. So they really knew how to use all the materials that they had at hand to their advantage. So people from the colonies, they died in battles, they made supplies. Some of them stayed away, thought it was a European conflict, and that the Europeans were oppressors, so let them attack one another. Some people joined in because they thought that it would lead to independence. The Europeans would see how well they fought and what a great job they did, and then after the war that they would then give them back their countries. And unfortunately, for the most part, that was not the case. Now talk about America joining the fight. By 1917, the fighting had gone from on land to being a stalemate, so things shifted to battles at sea. At first, the Germans used unrestricted submarine warfare. What they would do is seek any ship near Great Britain to really disrupt her navy and her shipping supplies to try and cut off the island. They would sink any ship that they thought had weapons on it. Lusitania was a cruise ship, a passenger ship, however it was carrying weapons. the people on the Lusitania were warned not to get on ship, that they knew they were carrying weapons and that Germany was going to sink that ship because they had weapons on it. People disregarded it, thought Germany wouldn't do it. They got on the boat, Lusitania took off, and the Lusitania was sunk, and many of the passengers died. America became outraged at this because there were U.S. citizens on board that died. There were 2 more attacks on passenger liners like this, and then from pressure from the international community, Germany decided to stop sinking neutral and passenger ships. However, by 1917, because the war effort wasn't going so well for the Germans, they began an unrestricted submarine warfare again and sunk 3 more American ships. Another thing that was pushing America towards war was a telegram sent by Germany's Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann. It was intended for Mexico, but it was intercepted. That's a picture of the Lusitania before it sunk. Here you see a propaganda photo of the Lusitania sinking. What I want you to do is I want you to study, analyze the photo. I want you to tell me, is it fact, is it fiction, what parts are fiction, and then why are they portrayed that way. What's the intended audience and what's the intended message. So please write that down. Make sure you have that in your notes. I'll leave this up here for a few minutes so you can do that. Back to the Zimmermann note. What it said is that Germany would help Mexico reconquer lands lost to the United States in the Mexican-American War. That would be your Southwest territories. It would be New Mexico, Arizona, and then Texas as well. So if Mexico invaded, helped with the war effort, kept America busy, then Germany would help out and help them reclaim their lands. Now, it wasn't really feasible. Mexico was never even considering this possibility. It was kind of a moot point, but what this did is it was the last straw. This was finally everyone in America was ready to get behind the war effort and attack Germany. So the United States declared war. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about the war on the home front. In 3 years, from 1914 to 17, there were more losses than any other war. So at this point, governments had to do something radical to try and end the war. So they went with a policy called total war, that every effort of their country would go towards ending the war. So governments took control of their economy, almost like communist countries. Many facilities were converted to munitions and factories, and a system of rationing was used in many countries. That would mean that citizens were only allowed to buy certain amounts of war effort goods, gasoline, butter, beef, things like that, because all of those things were going to go towards the troops on the front lines. Governments oftentimes would suppress anti-war activity, so protesting about the war, speaking bad about the war. Newscasts were censored, that would be radio and publication, and propaganda was used to make any type of small victory seem bigger and any type of bad defeat seem smaller. Women in the war. Women worked in factories because all the men were away, and many nurses went to the home front, were on the home front and on the war front, taking care of soldiers who were wounded on the battlefield or who needed to recuperate at home. Here, this is an American recruiting poster. We didn't use rationing. We used a way of propaganda, as you can see here, and the intent was get people to use less grain so that grain could be used overseas. So make them understand that if they don't cook bread, they don't eat bread as much, that grain can then be sent overseas for the troops to do that.